So the Florida legislature just introduced a couple of bills that could stop the governor's office from shaking down lobbyists for campaign contributions or interfering with university presidential searches. They've also gutted a really bad bill that was written by the car dealer lobby. And they're getting pretty close to passing a couple of really good bills that would help farmers and consumers find affordable ways to repair broken devices, everything from tractors to wheelchairs to cell phones. Coming up, we're going to talk about some of the positive developments happening so far in the Florida legislature's 2025 legislative session. Hello, and welcome to Seeking Rents, the podcast. I'm your host, Jason Garcia. I am the publisher of Seeking Rents. That's a newsletter in Florida about state politics, but with a particular emphasis on the ways that big businesses and other special interests influence public policy in this state. This is going to be an update from day 35 of the Florida legislature's 60-day legislative session, which means we are well past halfway now of the Florida legislature's 2025 legislative session. I spoke to a group of law students yesterday about the legislative session and mostly focused on issues that I'm paying attention to and that I think are worth, you know, getting active about or that folks should have some concerns about. And as you might imagine, it was a pretty dark talk, which probably fits coming from a person who, writes a newsletter and publishes a podcast that is essentially the old man yells at cloud meme from The Simpsons. And at the end of this, I was asked by one of the folks there, like, is anything good happening? And somehow my answer ended up with me talking about the perils of gerrymandering and the impact of a broken campaign finance system that allows like publics to give $100,000 checks to individual legislators. So safe to say I failed that question. So, what I thought I'd do today is focus on a few of the bills that are moving this session that I do think are genuinely really good and bills that I think everybody should feel good about, can feel good about. These are good government reforms. Doesn't matter if you're Republican, Democrat, MAGA, whatever. These are all bills that I think either good governance or pro-consumer type of bills that are moving this legislature. So today we're going to do rays of sunshine instead of the usual rain and hail and tornadoes and hurricanes. And I'm going to start today actually with a bill that was up this morning. Usually I try and sort of do a day in arrears basically, but my show, my podcast. And so the House State Affairs Committee earlier this morning took up House Bill 1445. Now, this was not a bill I particularly cared at all about to begin with. It struck me as just yet another example of kind of anti-immigrant pandering or demagoguery. I think the original bill, it essentially imposed like citizenship requirements and all sorts of jobs throughout state government. Like to be a member of a licensing board, you'd have to be a citizen or a citizen of the United States. Like why on earth we wouldn't allow a long-term permanent resident to be a member of a licensing board in the field that they have been involved in their whole careers makes no sense to me. I mean, if you really want to reform licensing boards, abolish licensing boards. But that's neither here nor there. The House State Affairs Committee today took up an amendment that like essentially completely rewrote this bill in a way that like suddenly takes a bill from being sort of a boring piece of pandering that I was uninterested to what I think is like a significant good government bill, and particularly as it comes to in relation to reining in some of the abuses of power we saw out of the DeSantis administration, specifically during last year's elections and during the governor's presidential run. And so let me just sort of wind you back to a few of the things that I'm thinking of here. So first, you might remember that when Ron DeSantis ran for president, a bunch of stories came out about how his senior staff was essentially pressuring lobbyists to make donations to his presidential campaign. They were literally shaking down people that need favors from the administration to donate to that presidential campaign against Donald Trump in the Republican primary. You might also remember we've talked a lot about some of the ways the DeSantis administration blurred lines in its campaigns against the citizen-led constitutional amendments that would have overturned the statewide abortion ban and legalized marijuana. So, for one example, the governor had his chief of staff chair fundraising committees to raise money from donors opposing these amendments. He also had state agencies use public resources to advertise and advocate against these amendments. In fact, in one case, the group sponsoring Amendment 4 sued the Agency for Healthcare Administration for essentially violating state laws that are supposed to prohibit state officials from interfering in elections. And in that, the reason I bring that up, that in that lawsuit, the DeSantis administration essentially argued that it was exempt from this law, which is I think people informally call it the Little Hatch Act or the Mini Hatch Act. It's because it's modeled after a federal law that's supposed to prevent federal officials from interfering in elections. The DeSantis administration argued in this lawsuit that it was exempt from this law entirely. It was just a wild position to take, and of course, to like my enduring frustration, the Florida Supreme Court does what it so often does and found an excuse not to actually resolve the issue and sort of threw this case out on different grounds. It didn't ever address the DeSantis administration claim that it was exempt from this anti-corruption law. Well, anyway, this amendment to House Bill 1445 this morning strips that exemption out of the way. It basically eliminates the entire rationale the DeSantis administration had for claiming they were exempt from the Little Hatch Act in Florida. What's more, it would explicitly prohibit state employees and officers outside of elected officials from fundraising for political causes, issues, political campaigns. It would make it very clear that they can still do campaign stuff, but only on their own time, not on time where they are working or they're expected to be working. It really starts to strengthen these laws that, to my mind, if this law had been in place, a lot of what we saw happen during DeSantis's presidential campaign and then during his sort of use of state power against the two constitutional amendments that followed, all of that would have been illegal under this bill. So this strikes me as like a really good government bill in terms of trying to rein in some of the potentially precedent-setting abuses that we saw that the DeSantis administration got away with last year. And like I said, this is just about you don't want public officials, state leaders interfering in elections, right? They just leave those up to voters and leave those up to people to make their cases on their private time, that sort of thing. So this is the sort of thing I think, generally speaking, if you set aside the individual issue, we can all agree that we don't want, state taxpayer dollars being spent on campaign finance ad or campaign ads, or we don't want our governor's chiefs of staff or deputy chiefs of staff or legislative affairs directors shaking down lobbyists for donations to campaigns. That stuff should not be allowed. And to my reading of House Bill 1445, it would not be allowed if this passes. And I just want to take a moment to sort of like marvel at the political dexterity here, sticking this onto, like I mentioned, this was kind of what I thought began as like a irritating anti-immigrant pandering bill or sort of boring anti-immigrant pandering, but they stick this all together. This becomes a tough bill for Ron DeSantis to veto, even if he wants to, if this passes, because now you'd be vetoing a bill that says, you got to be a citizen of the United States to be a state agency head or an elected official in Florida. So, that's a challenging veto to have on your record when you if you're ever planning to run for president again in another Republican primary. So, kudos to the House for putting those two things together, I suppose. Now let me move on to another couple of bills that also fall in this kind of good governance realm. And these are House Bill 1321 and Senate Bill 1726. And these deal with higher education. And specifically, the main thrust of these bills is they repeal just an awful public records exemption that the legislature passed a couple of years ago that essentially made university presidential searches confidential. They withheld from public. They allowed universities and the board of governors to hide the applicants for university presidential jobs until the very end of the process, when there was supposed to be the argument at the time was you'll still see the finalists. They've got to produce a pool of finalists, and then the public will see that before there's a final vote. And then immediately the DeSantis administration started gaming that system. And we all remember probably the University of Florida this bill passed just before the University of Florida did its presidential search. This new public records exemption went into law. The University of Florida gamed it by, when it came time to reveal the finalists, there was only one finalist. U.S. Senator Ben Sasse, former U.S. Senator Ben Sasse, Republican of Nebraska, who, if you're not aware, turned out to be an utter disaster as president of the University of Florida. Just kudos to student journalists at the Independent Florida Alligator who have exposed just like rampant inappropriate spending by Ben Sasse, who has since been essentially, he's gone. He's stepped down, and it has just been one revelation after another about inappropriate spending on travel, on like expensive sushi dinners, on high price consultants, on political allies getting to work on highly paid remote jobs while allegedly working for the University of Florida. It's just been It's been really ugly what's come out of there. And the entire reason Ben Sass became president of the University of Florida is because the Florida legislature passed this public records exemption that allowed the DeSantis administration to orchestrate this stuff all in secret. But the bill would actually go quite a bit further and addresses some of the more recent controversies we've seen. Like, when you go back and sort of look at the hallmark of Ron DeSantis' tenure as governor, I think one of the enduring legacies will be the sort of overt politicization, however you say that is a tough word to say, of public universities. Like the most recent example has been, Randy Fine, the kind of like right wing sort of bomb throwing congressman or state legislator who just became a congressman. Famously, he and Ron DeSantis have had a falling out, and they've become like mortal enemies. And it's been fun to watch a couple of the biggest bullies in Tallahassee fight with each other. I'm not going to lie, but as part of this, Ron DeSantis recently just unloaded on Fine after he got elected about calling him. I don't have the direct quote, but basically called him like a repellent personality, which, he's not wrong. Randy Fine says terrible things to people. He's another guy that has a history of punching down at people. But in this, Ron DeSantis was just sort of openly talking about how he tried to make Randy Fine president of, I think it was Florida Atlantic University, because Ron DeSantis claimed that nobody in the legislature wanted Randy Fine there. So he was just trying to get him out of the way and put him into another job. And the idea baked into here is that what we do, we just use these university presidential jobs to get rid of people that we don't want to have just as patronage jobs that we can like give to as rewards, or like in this case as like a box that we can go just put someone in just to get them out of the way, right? Like these are university presidential jobs. These should be some of the most important and prestigious jobs in all of state government, and we're turning them into like trash bins to hide people that Florida legislators don't like. Or in other cases, there was a really awful example with a state college in a rural part of the state. I think it was. I'll throw a link to the show notes so I don't get the college right, but it's down in kind of like Highlands County, Hardee County area where the DeSantis administration intervened when there was an opening and got the school's board of trustees, which are appointed by the governor, to essentially rewrite the job qualifications to reduce the qualifications. Also, they could give the job to State Representative Fred Hawkins, a Republican from the Orlando area. He's no longer state rep because he resigned to take this university presidential job. We've seen all kinds of just gross stuff like that, where we're just overtly turning these university presidential jobs into political appointments, essentially. And so these bills, House Bill 1321 and Senate Bill 1726, start to do a lot of reforms around this area. So, for instance, among other things, they would prohibit the governor's office or people on the governor's staff from having any communications with presidential related to presidential searches. Like you can't talk to boards of trustee members if during a presidential opening. It's trying to limit the governor's ability to influence these presidential searches and to dictate who these university board trustees should be hiring for these top jobs. We also recently had an episode where the DeSantis administration orchestrated the installation of Jeanette Nunez as the interim president of Florida International University without any sort of like advanced sort of notice or planning. It was just suddenly they decided, you know what? Let's have our existing guy go, and we think we'll hire the lieutenant governor as our new interim president. This legislation includes a bunch of language around you can't do that. You're going to have to establish like succession planning plans in advance, and you have to abide by those. And so you wouldn't be able to just suddenly like turn a politician into your interim president. So starting to try and restore some level of independence and oversight and separation of political interference from the governor's office with these university presidential jobs. I think that's a really good thing, right? We don't want, I don't think, I don't want, I would think most people would agree, we don't want a university system that like public universities that just like swing wildly from one administration to the next. We would like some sort of independence and some sort of like academic separation between politicians and sort of university leadership and faculty and professors. And so it strikes me that House Bill 1321 and Senate Bill 1726 could potentially go a long ways to undoing some of that damage. At minimum, undoing one of the worst public records exemptions they passed in the last 20 years. That alone would be a big win for Florida, and making sure that these university presidential jobs get decided in the sunlight rather in the shadows. And hopefully we never get another Ben Sass at a Florida university. So I'll jump ahead to a different kind of bill. So this is House Bill 429 and Senate Bill 1820. This is a bill that comes from the car dealers lobby. Now, I wrote a story about the House bill before when it first was filed, just before session. I was all prepared to go to war on this legislation all session. This was, like I said, written by the car dealer lobby, and the Senate bill, which came a little later, was even worse. It was explicitly designed to further empower car dealers from stopping Floridians from buying cars directly from manufacturers. The car dealer lobby, I'll have to do a longer podcast about this at one time. Car dealers are parasites. These are economic parasites. They are like middlemen that stand in between consumers and cars and drive up the prices. They're this antiquated system that exists from a day when there was only a handful of giant automakers and car dealers were mom and pop businesses. That is not what the world looks like. There's a bunch of competition in the car industry, but car dealers are giant businesses themselves, and they have these state sanctioned monopolies that force people to go through them if they want to buy new cars. It is just a horrible system. It should be obliterated and fired into the sun, and then we need to turn our attention to the alcohol distribution system, which has got the exact same problem. Anyway, I said this was a good news podcast. Stay with me. I promise it will be. This bill was going to be, to my mind, one of the ugliest pieces of legislation all session. Among other things, the Senate bill specifically was designed to shut down a company called Scout Motors. This is a startup backed by Volkswagen that is working on a new line of electric pickups and SUVs, and it has started to take these kind of like reservation deposits for cars that it plans to begin production of, I think in 2027. And a bunch of car dealers, including like one owned by a dealership company led by Norman Brahman, who is one of this billionaire Republican donor, one of the wealthiest car dealers in the world, I imagine. They have sued to try and stop Scout Motors from taking these deposits and try and shut down that process. This legislation was designed to sort of help that case along initially. But all of that stuff has been stripped out of these bills. These bills have been sort of essentially gutted to the point where they are fairly benign. Again, I am of the opinion that car dealers are economic parasites and that the whole dealership model should be destroyed. So I would be just as fine if these bills didn't pass at all. But to be fair, what's left behind in them is really mild, and the bad stuff is out. So as long as these bills, as long as we don't look at any sort of floor amendments, the fact that these bills, the bad stuff was stripped out of them, I think is a win for Florida consumers. Anybody that wants to buy a car, wants to buy a new car, having these bills gutted to the point they've been gutted is a good thing. And you know what? Kudos to the legislators sponsoring for being willing to back down at least on this one. The Florida legislature passed a really ugly car dealer bill a couple of years ago, and this was just going to expand on that even more, make it even worse. So again, positive podcast. So forget the bill from a couple of years ago right now. The fact that they backed away down. These bills have been weakened to the point that that's a clear win for anybody who does not own a car dealership. And then the last batch of bills I'll talk about today. We've written about this a little bit on the newsletter too. There are a bunch of bills moving this session that deal with a concept known as right to repair. This is a movement that is building across the country, and it's designed to help folks that buy expensive devices and equipment find ways to either be able to make repairs to these devices themselves or find affordable repairs rather than having to buy new ones altogether. And you see these in a lot of different contexts. So the places they most often show up are in agriculture equipment, like when a farmer's tractor breaks down or their combine breaks down, finding ways to be able to make sure that they can fix it rather than have to go spend, I don't know, $100,000 buying a new John Deere or that sort of thing. You also see it increasingly around mobile phones, cell phones. Like you want to be able to fix your iPhone potentially rather than go spend another $2,000 buying a new one, right? And also around wheelchairs, particularly motorized wheelchairs, which again, obviously an indispensable device. If you rely on a wheelchair to get around, you have to have a wheelchair, right? And so helping folks find a way to be able to repair their wheelchairs rather than have to shell out, these things, an advanced wheelchair can cost as much as a new car, right? So these bills, digital right to repair, among other things, the general basic idea is they require manufacturers to share, basically the access to the parts and the tools and the information or documentation that you that you would need to make repairs. You have to share that with the owners of these devices and also with independent repair shops. You're trying to create a valid repair market like exists for car repairs, right? And obviously, as you can imagine, as anybody who sort of knows anything about car repairs knows too, like this stuff has become more complicated. It's not as like it was like 20 years ago where your tractor breaks down, you just like grab your toolbox and you can fix it on your own. There's so much of these things are computerized. There's so much like digital stuff, like remote controlled software stuff that, you need to be able to have access to some of this information and these tools to be able to make these repairs. As you might imagine, these bills get mightily opposed by the manufacturing industry, by the John Deeres, by Apple in some cases, by the wheelchair manufacturers. At some point, I'll throw a link in the show notes to the story. You can find the names of these manufacturers. Obviously, these are enormous businesses. The last time agricultural right to repair showed up in the Florida legislature, John Deere deployed like a whole fleet of lobbyists to kill it. But we are seeing right to repair bills move all over the place this session. So the Senate has a bill that combines agriculture and mobile phone right to repair bills into one, essentially into one giant right to repair bill. And I think that is, if it hasn't already happened today, it's supposed to be being heard by the Senate Rules Committee today. And if it gets through there, it's ready for a full Senate vote. It's in position for that. The House, meanwhile, is ready to go on a right to repair wheelchair bill. That has been through its committees and is ready for a full vote. Now, it gets a little complicated. The various companion bills to these bills are kind of stuck. Like the House has a mobile phone right to repair bill that hasn't been heard at all, as far as I remember. The Senate has a wheelchair right to repair bill that's stuck in committee right now. Apparently, an unfriendly committee chair or something like that. But the fact that there's enough moving parts and enough of these bills are in position that you could be looking at an end of session where a lot of this stuff could be stacked together into one giant like great right to repair bill, or at least getting some of this stuff done. If you get ag done, that would be a really big win for Florida farmers in a legislature that loves to tell you how much they support Florida farmers. So it'd be nice. This is a great way for them to prove it. And just the fact that these bills have moved as far along as they have and are in the position they are, where we're looking at bills in the House and Senate that are ready for votes in the final couple of weeks of session. That's a pretty big deal, I think. The other way you can tell these are really good bills is all the lobbying against them tends to happen either behind the scenes or through front groups. So, a lot of the testimony and the public opposition to these is coming from one of these like low rent think tanks in Tallahassee called the James Madison Institute, which is like kind of, I think I've described it as conservative when convenient. And when they don't, when you crack inside the James Madison Institute's tax returns, what you'll immediately find is it got $25,000 the other year just from a trade group for Apple, Samsung, and Nokia, right? A group that has been among the most vociferous opponents to mobile phone right to repair. And so, it's Apple's not testifying itself; it's sending the James Madison Institute to do it instead. So, whenever opponents are trying to pretend that hide their opposition, that gives you a sense that this is a pretty good bill for consumers. So. Anyway, we will throw links to all of these in session. We could have some good governance. We could have some pro-consumer stuff happening. Obviously, a lot of bad stuff happening, and we'll get back to some more updates on those. Today's another busy day in Tallahassee. A bunch of those bills are moving, but there is a lot of good stuff happening as well. So important to call some of those out. And I just wish I'd remembered to list all these bills to those law school students rather than so I could have delivered a little bit of uplifting news out of the 2025 session, because there really is some. So, okay, we're gonna leave it here for today, and we'll be back again tomorrow, I'm sure, as the legislature starts to sort of set things up for an end game for session. So, okay, as always, however you're watching or listening, make sure to click like or subscribe so we spread this content around. If you can, leave a review, or if you've got any sort of thoughts, leave a comment or two. And then if you haven't already, please think about signing up for a subscription. Easiest way to find us is at seekingrentsfl.com. Subscriptions are free, but there is an option to voluntarily pay for one if you can afford it. All right, we'll talk again soon. Take care.